This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where in recognition of World Autism Acceptance Week, I'm speaking about sensory gardens, with a focus on design for people with autism. I have three guests: Camellia Taylor, who's designed the Natural Affinity Garden, which will be at the Chelsea Flower Show in May. After the show, the garden will be relocated to Kent to the charity Aspens, where it will be used by residents of and visitors to the site. Next I speak with Meraud Davis, who's overseeing the project at Aspens. And finally, to Alexis Selby, a foraging-obsessed, nature-loving, all-round amazing person, who's given us her take on using outdoor spaces with her son Jared. I started out by asking Camellia about the charity Aspens.
So the charity, they are based in Pembury in Kent, and they are a charity which has residential living for people on the autism spectrum and with learning disabilities. But they're also an open site, so they have day service users as well that come to the site. They are a brilliant charity. They have spaces for art, for pottery. They have animals. They have a horticultural section. They're a charity that provide a lot of care, and they have spaces in Pembury, but also stretching down towards Brighton.
I know, obviously, we're talking about a condition that has myriad versions, but can you speak in generalities? Are there particular challenges that people who are on the autism spectrum might come up against? Are there common themes that emerge?
So the first thing that I thought about was making sure that the garden was accessible. So it's an accessible space. It was really important to me that it was wheelchair friendly, and actually thinking of a space that was designed for wheelchairs. That was the forefront of the design. It's also a garden that's going to be used for people on the autism spectrum, but also with learning disabilities. And so I had to keep having both in mind. So for people on the autism spectrum, they can feel oversensitivity and undersensitivity. And so some need that sensory stimulation, but some people on the autism spectrum don't want that sensory stimulation. So I had to really consider that when creating a garden. So I created a garden that feels very calm. And so it doesn't feel stimulating when you first see it. It's very textured, it's very green. So green is a shorter wavelength, so our eyes don't need to adjust. So it makes us feel calm just seeing green. So it's this garden that has an overall feeling of calm for those that don't want too much stimulation. But how it's been planted, it targets the senses in different ways. And so if you do want that sensory stimulation, you just need to engage with it. And the senses have been split so that you could target the sense of taste, you could target the sense of touch. And so if a family member's there visiting somebody that lives there or a therapist, they can work with that person in multiple ways.
Actually, going back to what you were saying about the colour and the sense of green and calm, were there any specific colours that you needed to avoid, or was it more an overwhelming maybe patch of colour that you tried to not include?
I stayed away from the hot colours. So I stayed away from the reds and the oranges, and I've gone towards the cool colour palette just because it does make us feel calmer. It is mainly green and textured, but there will be some little pops of white and maybe some soft purples in there. So just colours that make us feel calm, because if they go into the space having this overall feeling of calm, then it's inclusive for everybody, because then we can take it up with that stimulation if that's what they would like. But actually, it just has this calm overall feeling.
Obviously, you've put the garden into different sections. Is there a danger that people might kind of say, okay, well, I can taste in that section, why can't I taste in that section? Is that something that you've explored with the people at Aspens or the people that work with the guys at Aspens?
Instead of it being a sensory garden where everything was all in together, we wanted it to be split into different sections so that you could target the senses independently. Because it was something that was important, because for some people, they wanted to be engaged with things for sight, to really be able to get their eye in and look at plants in detail. And for hearing, just to have fun with plants for hearing. So bringing in things like the breezer and the poppies, that when their petals fade, you can shake the little poppy sticks. So it was really important to not think of it as one large edible garden. It's a garden that has all these different sensory areas to stimulate our senses in different ways. And there's things like the path that winds through the garden. It's to take you on a journey, to make you feel that balance, and it will release sense underfoot. So when we spoke, it was about taking these senses that we have and breaking them down and splitting it so that they can have fun. And actually, it can also be a very therapeutic tool, but also something for the horticultural team, because the horticultural team that are there, they're brilliant and they're keen to be engaged with the garden, and they're keen to use it as an educational tool, because part of what this garden is it's going to be a garden that's maintained by the people of Aspens, and they have a horticultural team on site. And so it's going to be something that they're very much engaged with, the planting and the growing of everything in there.
Thanks, Camellia. I'm looking forward to seeing the garden at the show. Next up is Meraud Davis from Aspens, talking about how the garden will be used when it makes its way to the site.
Once the garden's been relocated, its primary use will be to support the people that we have living mainly on our Pembury site, but also so that people who live in our kind of more far-flung services can access it as well.
So is there a balance to be struck between being sensory but not overstimulating?
Well, one of the good things about a garden and being out in nature is that people can orientate towards what they like. So if you're in a room, for example, like a busy kitchen or in an office, you're kind of limited as to where you can go to get away from things. Whereas there's a sense of freedom when you're outside, in that you can orientate towards the things that actually you really like. So if somebody has a really strong preference for smells, so sometimes people might be undersensitive to smells, so they actively seek them out. Actually, they'll be able to find those smells that they particularly like. And similarly, if people really like visual stimulus, then they'll be able to seek out the areas of the garden that provide that kind of input for them. So it kind of allows people to make choices about what they want to do, what they want to experience in a really safe way.
Yeah, so presumably there'll be different elements within the garden that are kind of suitable for different people. I guess it'll be quite a multifaceted space.
Yeah, so I think Camellia spent a lot of time looking at what kind of plants might be appealing. So I know she's doing some that have got kind of quite a strong smell. So things like lavender, I suppose, can be quite appealing because you can brush past them and you get this release of lovely perfume, and different kind of visual impact plants. So things that will provide people with lots of different stimulus.
Thinking beyond the life of it being initially installed, is there an opportunity as well for people to get involved in maybe the maintenance of it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that we already offer is we do horticulture. We have a really lovely cutting garden. We've got a kitchen garden. We have some fantastic gardeners on site and a wonderful maintenance team who are all ready and very excited about the garden being moved on site, because it gives them additional opportunities. But then it will also give us opportunities to get the people we support more involved as well, because they already love what they do in our existing gardens. A lot of them enjoy being out in nature and spending time in the woods and on our outdoor play equipment. So it's another great opportunity to get people involved.
Yeah, I suppose because of the prestige behind the show, once it's installed, you've got a real example of horticultural excellence, which is another string to your bow, and it's another really lovely thing to have on site as an ornamental feature in addition to what you've already got going on. But going back to the sensory thing, have you got anything for sound factored in the garden?
Well, lots of plants will kind of provide a natural orchestra, I suppose. The plants that have been chosen will have that aspect of it considered. So, plants that rustle and move. So there is that kind of auditory feedback as well. And hopefully we'll be attracting a lot more nature to that particular area on site. So that will bring the benefits of birds and insects buzzing around. So the garden has been designed so that it incorporates all of our senses.
It sounds lovely. I mean, I really am looking forward to seeing it at the show. Also, I was thinking as well about the accessibility of the space. You might have people who have mobility issues or balance issues. Is that something that you've had to factor in as well?
Yeah, so it will be wheelchair accessible, which is fantastic. We do actually support a number of people who live within meters of where the garden's going to be, who are wheelchair users. And for them, having something that is so accessible, literally right on their doorstep, is going to be amazing. So a lot of our site is wheelchair accessible, but not all of it. So it's going to be a great benefit to them as well. Something that they can really enjoy and hopefully develop a bit more of a kind of sense of independence as well.
Thanks, Meraud. I'm sure it will. Now on to my final guest, Alexis.
Hi, my name is Alexis and I'm a parent to Jared, who is a child that has delayed functioning autism and learning difficulties. He's also non-verbal.
So obviously you take Jared out and about. You've got your own garden and Jared likes being outdoors. So what I wanted to find out was kind of a little bit about what makes your life easier when you're using outdoor spaces, and sometimes what doesn't make your life easier because the gardens aren't particularly designed with Jared's needs in mind. So I thought it would be really good to start talking about Jared and then moving on to what it is that makes a garden good and not so good. So tell me about Jared first.
So Jared is much happier in natural surroundings, we've found. He also has a lot of difficulty communicating because he's non-verbal. So we tend to communicate with him with pictures. He suffers from high levels of anxiety. So we often visit gardens and open gardens and National Trust gardens.
You emailed me actually loads of really good points. And one of the things that you emailed me was garden features that benefit Jared. So do you want to talk me through a few of the things that you really enjoy and Jared really enjoys in a garden?
Jared is definitely drawn to water, which is a good and a bad thing, because if it's dangerous water, then it can make us very nervous if he's going to dive in and have a swim, or if he's going to maybe try and drink some of the water also is a bit of a concern. But he does love water and he loves water features especially. So he likes moving water and the sound of water. So we found that he really enjoys that. He also really loves to touch and smell any of the plants in the garden, which means we've had to make sure that none in our garden are poisonous and keep a good eye out for that while we're walking around open gardens. I think that's actually quite a good thing for him also, because he's quite restricted with his dietary requirements because he's quite a fussy eater. So I think it's quite good if he wants to taste a plant or put it in his mouth. I'm hoping that that will help him to be more adventurous in the future as well. He also loves wind features, so anything that catches the wind. He likes to look at windmills and he likes to hear wind chimes, and that adds another element, especially if they've got little bits of glass in them, maybe coloured glass, which can catch his eye and draw his attention as well. We do struggle with wheelchair accessibility because he suffers from such high levels of anxiety. He's also epileptic, so we have to have a backup just in case he does have a fit. But we do struggle if a place isn't wheelchair accessible. So lots of interesting gardens have bits that we can't reach because they've got very sweet little paths that we can't actually push him down. But yeah, wheelchair accessibility is quite big. Also, some of his friends have balance issues, so they need it to be quite good and firm underfoot so that they don't fall over, and they enjoy the process of being in the garden. Places to sit are great, partly for tired parents, but also partly for children just to sit and have a look at maybe some interesting feature. Also, circular routes are good because they might like to have a good old run around and end up where they started, which makes them feel a bit reassured. And we found that toilets are quite handy in changing facilities, but it's understandable if places can't always cater to that.
Excellent. So going back to the water thing, is it a problem if there is water there, but it may be deep or it may be muddy water or something? Is it a problem if it's not accessible because it's something that Jared wants to get into, but he can't necessarily if it's got various things wrong with it?
I think as long as it is regularly open or regularly off limits. So I think that couldn't change. So if we go to our local park that has a great big lake that has ducks on it that he likes, he's learnt over time that he's not allowed to go in that one and accepts that very well. But if it was one that he was sometimes allowed in and sometimes wasn't allowed in, that would be very difficult.
Yeah, ditto. That is a concern when you said to me about going there at different times of the day.
Yeah.
Is it a question of it would be good if it was open 24/7 because then if he wants to go, he can go?
Yeah, it's very difficult, especially if times change a lot as well. So if something is open at a certain time, that's okay and you can work around that as a parent. But the times can't change. That would be very difficult, especially without warning. I think then that would be very difficult for a parent, make anxiety levels high of both of us.
That brings us naturally on really to the bad features that you found in gardens. And you mentioned shops as well. So do you want to just go through a few things that you can find quite challenging?
Things that are challenging is maybe a favourite path that just happens to be shut. Anything that changes without warning. We've also been to parks that have a lovely little shop that he loves to go in and maybe choose a treat. And then the next day, maybe it's not open, or maybe it's got an opening time that isn't correct. So that also is a very difficult thing for Jared and others with autism to cope with, things that don't stay constant.
And so going back to the plants as well and the tasting thing, and I presume as well touching plants, is there a need to just be careful what you put in a garden?
Yeah, I think there's a massive need, because if a parent has to be watching out all the time what a child may touch and may put in their mouth, it means that nobody's very relaxed. And I also think it's quite important for them to have that sensory feedback of, if not tasting, definitely touching a soft plant and definitely smelling a beautiful smelling plant. So yeah, you would have to be careful that it wasn't toxic to touch or toxic to eat.
And I'm thinking kind of things that visit plants. Obviously, you've got bees, you've got all sorts of insects and wildlife. Is that a good thing or can that be a challenge?
I think that's quite a good thing. Jared has been stung twice, but he recovered well. And I think that also taught him about nature and that some things are dangerous. So that was useful to him because he didn't suffer badly. But I think they like to see things that visit. Jared loves any birds, and his friend loves a lot of bees. He loves to watch the bees fly and he loves to hear their noise. So I think that's a positive thing, actually.
And going back to the shops and the kind of managing of expectations, you raised a really important point when we were chatting before, which was that idea of taking turns and queuing. Does that cause problems?
Yeah, that's true, actually. It's a good point. Queuing is an absolute nightmare usually. There doesn't seem to be many exceptions of how to tolerate a queue, or if they're going to tolerate one. I would personally steer clear of anywhere I knew that was going to have queues for anything interesting that he might want to interact with. And waiting for anything really is very difficult. So yes, definitely. An area where there was queuing or waiting for something really fun would be quite difficult, and I'd probably try to avoid that.
And so, again, you mentioned your anxiety levels if you're out and about. Are there provisions that need to be made for parents?
I think as long as the provisions for their care, like we've discussed, with no waiting or regular opening hours, I think a happy parent also makes for a happy child. And if you're not worrying about your child eating poisonous things or falling in dangerous areas of water, then I think that you stay quite calm, which also makes the visit a lot more pleasurable for the child.
And one of the things, again, we spoke about was the use of pictures, and that is twofold, really. There's pictures inside the garden, which can explain what's happening, but also before you go. Can you talk about how that would help?
Yeah, there's such a thing as a social story, which we found is really useful. And basically, it's a story that would inform the child or adult suffering from anxiety or autism of what is going to happen and where this place is, with pictures of where maybe you would park, pictures of any particular areas of interest, what to expect, and then also any other extra details that would make the parents well informed as well. But it's also really useful. You could have it downloadable before you go. A child is usually very anxious the first time they go and visit anywhere, but a social story can help to reduce that anxiety quite a lot, actually, by informing them of all these things before they go and making it a less scary first visit.
And does that tie into the pictures that you use with Jared?
Yes, it does. I use picture exchange communication, which is PEX, with Jared, and he's very reliant on that to communicate with me, but also to reduce his own anxiety when I show him what we're going to do for that day using the pictures. So Social Story could have quite a few pictures in it for children that can't read. Also for children that are non-verbal, it would help them to see what's happening. And they can actually hold that in their hand as a piece of security, so they know what they're doing for the day.
So that pretty much is the end of my questions, because you've been so good at communicating. But just bear in mind, obviously, this podcast goes out to a lot of professional gardeners and landscape architects, garden designers. Is there anything that you would like to say to people who might be designing spaces that are for everyone?
Yes, I think just try and make it as accessible as possible with as many interesting sensory things as possible to keep the children interested and probably make them happy in nature and make them keep learning about nature, which is good for their anxiety and good for the anxiety of their parents.
So actually, just touching on that, I was thinking about different areas in a garden. Does it pay to have quite a complex space in terms of design, or is it good to have just like an open expanse of grass and then some stuff around the edge, or is it horses for courses?
I think it can be horses for courses because children will still like discovering spaces. So if they're quite complex and take a lot of discovery, that's quite nice for them. But also open spaces are good. I have been to gardens where the open spaces of grass were not available for the children to run on, which made it very difficult. It was a beautiful garden, but unfortunately, yes, they couldn't run on the grass. So that made it very difficult for us. But yeah, it definitely could be horses for courses. So either quite complex and interesting or quite open and plain. Maybe a mixture of the two would be great so that a child can choose which area they feel most comfortable in.
Many thanks to Camellia and Meraud. I wish them luck with the show and the relocation of the garden to Aspens. A big thank you to Alexis as well, and to the other members of the Supermums, Rachel and Sue May, who contributed feedback for the episode. Thanks to you for listening. Do please check out the links in this episode if you're interested in finding out more, as there's loads of good stuff there. Here's Dr. Ian Bedford now, with a possible explanation as to why your Narcissus bulbs aren't performing.
There's different reasons why daffodils and their related species might come up blind in the spring, which means that they produce their leaves but not their flower buds. Often, it's down to the environmental and climatical conditions, or even the age of the bulb, but it could also be an indication that the bulb is diseased, or that it's under attack from a pest. Although daffodils don't have many plant pests, there is one that can be a serious problem, often damaging and destroying many bulbs where it's become established. And this is the large Narcissus bulb fly, a hoverfly that first appeared in the UK about 120 years ago and has now become widespread. This bulb fly is about 1.5 centimetres in length and looks very much like a small hairy bumblebee, but with only one pair of wings. Varying in colour, from yellow to dark brown, they emerge on sunny days during mid-May to mate. The females then seek out the senescing daffodil leaves and lay their eggs on the neck of the bulbs. These hatch into little maggots that crawl down to the bottom of the bulb, entering it through the basal plate. Once inside, the maggots start to devour the fleshy centre, which includes the following year's flower buds. By the following spring, the maggots are fully grown, plump and creamy white in colour, and they'll leave the bulbs to pupate within the surrounding soil. Affected bulbs that were not killed by the infestation will likely survive to produce a few thin leaves before they then start to rot. Since there are no chemical options for controlling the large Narcissus bulb fly, cultural methods will need to be used. These can include growing daffodils in exposed locations rather than the shelter conditions that the bulb fly prefers, and also removing and disposing of any weak plants in early spring that could be displaying signs of a bulb fly infestation.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.